Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Emily Bukai with Kimley Horn and Associates, and I'll be your moderator for today's discussion about battery storage. In the spirit of the renewable energy industry, we wanted to highlight the battery storage sector, commonly known as battery energy storage systems, or I'm sure you've heard the acronym BESS. Although battery storage is commonly tied to renewable energy, such as solar and wind, battery storage has many other applications outside of the renewable industry and can be found in more traditional development settings as well. The topics we're going to talk about today will have more of a bias towards the utility scale battery storage side. However, the topics are all still very applicable to other disciplines and types of development. We are seeing energy challenges across the industry, and battery storage is just one way to tackle our energy needs by playing an important role in renewable energy, responding to energy demands, and helping to create grid resiliency. So just a couple of housekeeping items. This is a live session that'll be recorded. Attendees on the call will not have access to video or muting functions, but you will have access to the Q&A tool. We're going to try to save some time at the end for questions. So as questions arise during the meeting, feel free to add those into the questions and answers tool, and one of my colleagues will be filtering through those behind the scenes, and then he will hop on at the end if we have time, and he'll go through asking those. We want to make sure we're being respectful of everyone's time. So if we aren't able to get to any questions and answers during this session, we will be providing all of the panelists' contact information as well as my contact information when we send out a copy of the recording. So please feel free to reach out with any follow-up questions that you may have, and we will get those answered for you. So with that, we will jump into introducing our awesome group of panelists. They are helping trailblaze the rapidly growing and constantly changing battery storage industry. So James, we'll go ahead and start with you. If you could just give a quick background.
Thanks, Emily. Hi, everyone. This is James Robinson with Euclid Power. I'm the Director of Energy Storage at Euclid. I've worked in the project development field focused on energy storage for 5 years or so now. Euclid's mission is to help facilitate and speed up the build out of renewable energy projects, whether that's solar or energy storage. And to do that, we help our clients move through project development and the acquisition of projects through a software platform that we have built out, and also through consulting work, which is what my team, I'm part of the services team. And we provide consulting work and really focus on mergers and acquisitions, project development, and the execution and build out of projects. My focus is energy storage. We also do solar. So yeah, that's what I have, and I'm happy to be on this panel.
Happy to have you. Skylar, want to go next?
Of course. Hello, everyone. My name is Skylar Tennis. I've been in the renewable energy space for about 11 years, done everything from fuel cells to solar to battery storage, behind the meter, in front of the meter. Currently, my role is Vice President of Operations with InterSmart Storage. We're a Solana Beach-based company. We're currently developing a 165 megawatt BESS portfolio over 12 sites throughout the San Diego County area, with plans to grow rapidly in the rest of the state of California. So happy to be here.
Thanks, Skylar. All right, on to our very own Austin Martin.
Thanks, Emily. As Emily mentioned, I'm Austin Martin. I sit down here in Houston, Texas. I've worked in the renewable energy for about 7 years now. I've done everything from wind farm design, solar design, and now have a focus on battery energy storage systems. We're a national consulting firm. We aid in everything from the project infancy to construction of the project. We can do survey entitlements, environmental work, and then construction docs, both on the electrical and also the civil side, with all the subset disciplines to make those come to fruition.
Thank you, Austin. All right, jumping straight into our first topic. Skylar, I'll direct this one to you first. So there are many reasons for entities to get involved in battery storage, from recent legislation of the Inflation Reduction Act, also known as the IRA, as well as benefits that storage can bring to the overall community and grid. Can you touch on a quick background first of just what the Inflation Reduction Act is and what it means, and why entities should be looking at BESS as a part of their portfolio?
Yeah, absolutely. So the IRA was an act by the government that has a battery storage supplement as on top of solar that's previously been included. This is the first time that BESS has been included as a standalone. That offers for tax incentives of up to 30% based on different factors, whether you're in a disadvantaged community, whether you're using American-made products. There's a lot of different aspects that will increase that percentage. But yeah, basically a 30% percentage tax credit from the federal government on these projects. Something that the battery storage does for renewable portfolio in general. All renewables like wind and solar are inherently inconsistent forms of generation. If a cloud goes over a solar field or the wind isn't blowing, the kW output can vary greatly. So by charging the batteries whenever the renewable output is in excess and discharging in times of low energy production, a battery storage system, it takes the guesswork out of that daily kW production and allows you to have consistent production every day.
And would you say that helps just overall with like grid resiliency, helping eliminate volatility of renewables?
Yeah, absolutely. So with the increase in renewables, there are some frequency control issues. So the battery storage does provide frequency control, and then you've got an almost instantaneous charge or discharge function to where if there is excess power on the grid, it can be charged and saved for later. Or if there's generation strain on the grid in the event of a heat wave or other high power consumption events, it can discharge and help supplement that.
And this can be directed to any of the three panelists, but how would you say the IRA, the recent legislation? So my understanding is the BESS portion was implemented at the beginning of this year, which is why we're seeing such a rise in demand as well. So how would you say the IRA has impacted the BESS market from a supply chain perspective? So pricing, Skylar, I know you touched a little bit on just like domestic supply chain. Has there been impacts that you've seen to funding that have maybe caused procurement issues and delays? I guess what are some trends that you guys are seeing from the recent legislation?
Yeah, so supply chain, like I said, it is incentivizing American-based companies, incentivizing the use of American-based companies. I've also seen changes on the funding front. We're now getting a lot more financial institutions that are interested in these projects because of that IRA, which can be used as a tax shield and other things. So yeah.
Leads me to my next question. So, James, how would you say entities in the market have changed throughout the last several years? So I guess to follow up on Skylar's kind of comment, it seems like due to the recent the recent tax incentives that now, there's different players in the game who are now kind of involved where historically they haven't been as far as funding and investments and things like that.
Yeah, so batteries are still a relatively new technology, at least on the scale that we are seeing them now. And it's really only been over the past couple of years that they've become mainstream enough for some of the big players in the industry to be comfortable investing money, equity and debt in battery storage projects. So that's not exactly an IRA thing as much as it is just the industry maturing. And, we saw the same kind of ramp up with solar, and nowadays solar is just like a very well understood and well-known asset that can be invested in. And battery storage is getting to that point also. And with that comes just some of the larger entities that are wanting to get involved and put their money to work in these types of projects.
Yeah,
And
James, I'm sorry to cut you off, Emily, but just to reiterate like a point that James is making, as the technology is advancing quicker, I mean, we're seeing it from not only the utility scale side, but small sites as well. I mean, you get commercial developers, traditional real estate guys that will jump into the space and take advantage of some of these tax credits that they may have usable space behind existing facilities. So it's not only a utility scale application that we're seeing this in. I mean, as technology progresses, we're seeing this all over the marketplace.
Right. And Austin, that was, kind of my question to you is from a consulting side, how have you seen entities in the market change? And, you kind of already answered, but how do you see this playing into other trends and impacting other types of markets aside from just the renewable energy market?
Yeah, definitely. I think you're seeing it kind of firsthand out there in California. I think they're on the forefront of adopting some of these codes and policies that lends itself well to the renewable industry. I believe in our conversation that, starting this year, the codes and ordinances have changed in building code in California, where they now have to start planning for some of these renewable assets in their design phase of the projects. So I think we're going to start seeing this really infiltrate more markets than just a renewable facet.
Right. And it seems like these same trends, aren't just specific to California or Texas. They're trends that we're going to be seeing across the entire country. To kind of piggyback off what you said, I know, states like California and New York have already implemented energy code requirements for 2023. They're going to require solar battery storage. That'll impact almost every type of development. So awesome. So these projects will usually require interface with grid operators. So James, to pass this one over to you, in your opinion, what is the best way to interface with the grid operators across the country? Are there any things that you would recommend doing ahead of time to make sure that your project has a smooth interaction?
Yeah, so depending on where you are trying to develop a battery project in the country, you're going to be interfacing with different grid operators. And you're for the utility scale side of things, at least, you're typically interfacing with two different entities. One is the owner of the wires near where you're trying to interconnect. So that's like the transmission owner. Think of like a CenterPoint or like a PG&E. And one is like the grid operator, the ISO. So in Texas, that's ERCOT. In California, that's CAISO. And depending on what you're trying to do and what services you're trying to provide, there's very regimented procedures that you need to follow in order to successfully interconnect, both with the interconnection process with the transmission owner and also the market participation process with the ISO. So, the best piece of advice that I could offer is just make sure that you have a team that you're working with that's gone through the process before with the local in that specific area. And there's definitely nuances between the rules and regulations depending on where you are, and you don't necessarily want to be trying to digest like the 100+ page tariffs and figure it out from scratch, because you can lose a lot of time that way and just get caught up in some of the nuances. So you ideally want to be working with a firm that's gone through the process.
And Skylar, I know your EnerSmart's model is a little bit different. You guys do a lot of smaller standalone sites in urban areas. So would you echo similar thoughts, or can you kind of talk through your thought process?
Yeah. So we do things a little bit different. We are utility scale, but we're connecting at the distribution level. So 12 kV to get to out here at CAISO, the independent system operator, to do the trading at that level. So there's two entities now that we have to coordinate with. You now have to coordinate with the local utility to be able to connect to their lines and do that, per their standards. And then you also have to coordinate that with CAISO, or in Texas, ERCOT, whoever the independent system operator is. So I mean, it's the same thing I can say with permitting, right? Early and often, reach out to the utilities, let them know what you're trying to do, research all their documentation. Most of the ones that do this a lot have a substantial amount of information online to sift through, get meetings set up, talk to your local interconnection expert at the utility, get their feedback. And yeah, expect changes. expect changes.
It's a good word of advice.
This is getting more and more. You are seeing battery storage more and more, but there is a load aspect to this. So with solar and with wind, you're always putting power on the grid. On the utility scale solar, or sorry, utility scale BESS without solar or wind supplementing it, you're charging off the grid. So there's an extra aspect there that's in play and generally a part of their studies that can affect these systems greatly.
Austin, what would you say from, the civil side? Is there anything that, from a consulting side that we should be looking at or keeping in mind in kind of the early stages of projects, reviewing agreements, things like that?
Definitely, like James and Skylar mentioned, definitely communication early and often, understanding the rules and regulations of the local jurisdiction that you're entering into. One of the nuances to standalone battery storage that differs greatly from solar and wind is generally the detention aspect. With this being a newer technology, a lot of codes and ordinances hasn't caught up to this type of development yet. So a lot of it is educating the jurisdiction and getting them on board with this type of project. Unfortunately, due to this being a newer technology, they like to apply some of their more traditional codes and ordinances to these projects, which sometimes have tighter regulations and restrictions on the project. So just for example, one aspect that's commonly overlooked is detention. In some areas, detention is not required, mainly speaking for Texas. Detention is not required on solar. Some jurisdictions are catching up. However, on battery storage, 9 times out of 10, I have seen detention be required due to this type of development.
Yeah, that's common for us over in California as well. So from either the consulting design side or the developer side, what would you say have been some of the biggest challenges in your local markets when working with grid operators and local utilities? I know, Skylar, you kind of touched on technology changing. They're not very familiar with the system, but I guess, are there any, lessons learned that you would give in kind of dealing with all the utility specific entities early on?
Know their handbook well.
Okay.
And bring that stuff up to them ahead of time. There's, these utilities have a lot of stuff going on. They deal with the fires out here. They deal with ice out in Texas. They've got a lot of stuff going on, and they're getting pulled in a lot of directions. So it is best to do your homework and bring the questions to them. Don't wait 6 months and then have them be reviewing the project and say, "Oh, we'd like you to add a 20-foot wide access path through the entire site that wasn't originally planned for." It can really cause some issues with your system size when it takes up space that now you can't utilize for the battery. So yeah, it kind of goes back to the due diligence, right? Just do your homework and bring the stuff up to them. It's better to bring it up and have them say, "No, it's not required," or "Yes, it is," versus somebody bringing it up 6 months later. Yeah,
I guess kind of adding on to that point, Skylar, I know, I've interfaced with James previously. So I guess, James, would you have any advice? Like, how does some of this due diligence kind of impact what equipment selections you might make for these sites? I mean, I know ultimately there's a target goal that you're trying to get out of each of the sites, but in the due diligence phase, is this impacting what equipment is selected?
Yeah, I mean, during the due diligence phase, we're taking all of the inputs that we're getting from, for example, what land do we have control over, right? That's kind of the first one. So how much acreage do you ideally have? And then you're layering on top, are there any wetlands we need to deal with? Are there and avoid? Are there any setbacks that the local AHJ is going to put into place? As Austin already mentioned, is there a retention pond requirement that is going to take up some space on the site? And maybe there's some cultural stuff as well, although that's a little bit less common. But at the end of the day, like, we will kind of collate that into one place. And then right now we're working with Austin's team to kind of layer all of that onto one map and make sure that we understand exactly how much area we actually have to build our system. Access roads are another one I forgot to mention that Skylar brought up. But yeah, and so then when it comes to equipment selection, there are some trade-offs between different equipment suppliers when it comes to the energy density. So that's certainly something that we'll take into account. And it varies a little bit between part of it's the technology, like the chemistry involved, and other parts are just their architecture and their system architecture and like how they're designing the system, and are the inverters included in the cabinet, or are they separate, and like that type of thing. So like all of that kind of gets superimposed over the site layout to come up with how much capacity we actually can fit. And ideally it's the amount that we wanted and the amount that we have that the utility is able to take, and everything kind of matches up there.
Yeah, definitely, James. And I would recommend, like, just my lessons learned is like, interfacing with developers from the consulting side is also bring a team on board as early as you can. Find a partner to walk through this with you from kind of the site constraint level. Oftentimes, we look at some sites with rose-colored glasses thinking, oh, I'm going to get 150 megawatts out of this site. But, we don't take into account all of the constraints there. And, while I enjoy working with you guys, I don't always like being the bad guy and saying, well, now we have this constraint we have to deal with, so it's going to kind of kill your deal, right? So definitely engage a trusted partner early and often, and let's step through the process together.
Skylar, I know we've had to deal with a lot of that too. Kind of piggybacking on to the technology side and how that affects, how you look at sites. James, I know you touched on different technology, can have different charging abilities, different chemistries, things like that. So Skylar, with EnerSmart having a lot of our sites are maybe an acre in size, and so obviously space is a huge constraint, and like maximizing that output. So from your perspective, are there certain types of technology that you typically would gravitate towards? And if you could kind of just talk more of like how that plays into how you guys are able to make your sites work and to serve the grid and still produce enough power that fits within, a smaller footprint.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, power density is key. The LFP gives us the best power density, and, I always compare it to new cell phones being released. I mean, by the time we start one of these projects to the time that we've got a permit to actually put a shovel in the ground, we're talking, generally 12 to 18 months, and there's 2 or 3 new releases of technology to where they're, doubling their power density. We've had this happen a couple of times now. So there's a couple different things too, right? You may have an acre of land that is right next to a substation with a ton of capacity. At that point, the highest density is going to be the most valuable. You can get the most on that site, interconnect the most to that substation. At the same time, you may find an acre of land next to a substation with little to no capacity, and you can only put a single system. At that point, you can look at other benefits. We use a zinc aqueous technology called the EOS. That is an extremely low fire risk, almost none. Just the power density is much less, so it does take up a lot more space. But there's other cost factors too that play into it that make those make sense for ones with, again, low capacity on the grid, but maybe a lot of space in the area. So that's the way we look at it.
James, would you say that's similar for you guys, or that could be applied to larger footprint projects, or do you have a different process?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. It's really just, sometimes you have plenty of room on a site and then you don't have to make any trade-offs, but other times you are constrained. And so, yeah, it becomes like, well, can we make the roads a little less wide? Is the fire department going to be okay with that? Like, what are the setbacks, and or can we sharpen the pencil there, and that type of thing. But yeah, I'd say just in general, it's kind of like a puzzle, like trying to fit what you can fit in the site space you have available. The other thing that we sometimes look at is if we do have extra space, that's great, because we can always potentially use that in the future for something else, even if we're not trying to build that out right away. Like maybe keeping extra space available is always kind of a good optionality for something that may come down the road later.
Do you usually keep like future augmentation in mind for your projects, or?
It depends on the use case.
Okay.
I mean, sometimes it's like you just want to max out everything you have now.
Right.
And sometimes you don't need to do that as much. And it also kind of comes down to like, what's the use case on the batteries? Because in some jurisdictions, like I used to work on a lot of projects in New York, and you really want to qualify for capacity markets there, which require a 4-hour, it's a 4-hour product, which means that your revenue is basically like, as you start using the battery and it starts dropping below that 4 hours, like you're losing linear like amounts of money that you're getting. So like you ideally want to keep yourself as close to that 4-hour limit over the life of the project as you can. Where in Texas, that's not as much, they don't have a capacity market. So it's a little bit different there, where it's like you don't necessarily need to keep a specific like length of discharge. It's more about just like how many kilowatt hours can you get out, and so that changes the augmentation strategy a little bit.
And obviously this all, Austin, from your perspective, depending on equipment type, it all falls under electrical and civil footprint and what's feasible as far as grading and site constraints and things like that. So can you kind of talk more on how that could impact you and what some of the best practices that you would use?
Yeah, definitely. So working in tandem with a developer such as James and Skylar, I mean, it comes down to their ultimate goals for the project, right? So we like to understand their goals and objectives, what power threshold they're trying to get out of the site. We can help evaluate like what equipment should be selected, so that way we understand the space required for each of the batteries and inverters to mitigate the fire risk. And then from there, that really kind of sets the framework. We look at all of the studies that we've done through the due diligence process and look at the local codes and criteria in order to ensure that we're up out of any inundated areas. We're providing the required detention that may be implemented by that jurisdiction. And then that will allow us to formulate a design to reach their desired capacity.
So just to quickly touch on decommissioning, I know that the technology is constantly changing. There's a ton of different types of batteries. We're starting to see some like being utilized from recycled batteries and things like that. But since a lot of these projects haven't gone through a full life cycle yet, they haven't really yet come offline. Skylar, James, from a developer perspective, can you high level just touch on what decommissioning could look like for these systems? Austin, you too, like, are there things that you guys are seeing currently from AHJs being required and things like that?
I can jump in on this one. So I see a lot from the banks and the investors, right? They want to see what's going to happen at the end of life on this. The third-party engineers, the independent engineers. I haven't seen too much come up from the jurisdictions. If they do, it's just a bond or something similar. But I mean, honestly, our answer right now is there's nothing official yet. There's not a lot of systems out there that are being decommissioned right now. They're fresh. They've been installed for maybe 5 years at this point. So again, a lot of times we'll post bonds to show that, look, we're going to be removing the system in 20 years. And we expect that market to change rapidly. So that's also a part of our answer, right? Right now I'm seeing batteries from the EVs, from electric vehicles, being recycled and actually put into containers and being used for BESS for the purpose that we're using them for. So there's going to be a rapid expansion of companies that are going to be not only recycling this material, but bettering the way that they currently recycle them. So yeah, we don't have anything solidified yet, but over the next 5 to 10 years, we're excited to see what they're going to be able to use these for.
Right. So it seems like a lot of future reuse or recycling options that could come into play as the equipment changes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when these are decommissioned, they're still going to be, if I recall correctly, I think 60 or 70% capacity, 65. So yeah, I mean, when you're talking 20 megawatts of power at 65% capacity, there's still something that can be done with that. Absolutely.
Austin, working on, you're familiar with the solar and wind side. Is there any like similarities you would maybe draw to the solar side that you've seen on decommissioning? Or
I mean, I know like it's similar to the battery storage world where technology is progressing. We're finding different uses for the panels. I mean, they're being recycled for their components. So, I mean, there's a lot of advancements, and I'm excited to see where the recycling industry and what uses we can come up with for either the materials or the equipment themselves, like Skylar mentioned. there's still life left at the end of the project. So what can we do with it, right?
Right. All right. So moving on to my favorite topic, siting and permitting. So I know you guys all have kind of already touched on some of these topics in this conversation, but siting permitting can obviously be a big hurdle as battery storage is a new concept to AHJs. In most cases, battery storage is not a use that has been incorporated into many zoning codes across the country. So maybe James, I'll have you speak to this first, but could you maybe walk us through some of the preliminary due diligence when siting these projects? Proximity to a substation. I know you guys already kind of talked about land and some of the studies, but maybe just diving into that, any red flags that you look for when looking at certain sites?
Sure. I mean, you mentioned the local zoning or codes, and I think that's a big one, because if the local municipality has a code that you are not going to be able to meet, whether that's a zoning code or some other code, then that can potentially stop the project from being built. And it really does vary across, depending on where you are. Even within a given state, some jurisdictions have very regimented zoning codes for what you can put where. Others don't have any zoning code at all. I'd say generally speaking, like New York City, where I have done some work, and California tend to be the most. California's where Skylar does his work. Like those tend to be the most restrictive, and Texas tends to be a little bit easier, but that's not necessarily true across the board. Like there are jurisdictions within Texas that take a pretty close view of like what's being put where. So that. The trick with the development is like really like ideally you have all this information up front and you can like know exactly where you can put a project that's going to like check all the boxes and go smoothly sailing through. But in reality, it's usually about like trying to figure out how do you sequence getting the information that you need so that if something's not going to work, at least you find out early and can move on to somewhere else. Yeah, it's the zoning's a big one, and then some of the items that we talked about earlier, like the wetlands and the flood zones and all that type of thing, can also need to be taken into account.
Yeah, I think just to elaborate on a little bit of that, what may seem scary to most, like floodplains, for example. I mean, it's not absolutely a deal killer just because you see floodplain on your site. That's where kind of bringing in a team around you to do that due diligence and research those things. I mean, there's ways around it, but obviously it does have an impact to not only like budgets, but time constraints. So understanding those nuances, like you mentioned, James, really paints a good picture for your overall goal to understand when can I start construction, when can this project come online, and just getting involved early and often is key in understanding site constraints.
Yeah, and these projects are all over the country and in every jurisdiction. So Skylar, James, what would you say? Like, would you say that it's critical to have local consultants with knowledge in each particular jurisdiction?
100%. Yeah. I mean, not that any engineers are any different on the East Coast than they are the West Coast, but there are a lot of nuances on both coasts that, from what I've seen, some engineers don't tend to understand on the others, right? Like there's a lot of nuances with the cities. You've got a frost line out in the Northeast. You don't have anything out. So there's a lot of variables. Having local people that work with the local jurisdictions often, they're already in there every week. They already know the players involved. They already know the processes. It can save you months on your schedule. You may be able to save, a few 10, 20 grand by going with somebody cheaper. But if they don't know the process, you'll lose time and money by having them learn throughout.
I think, Skylar, like the point you just made, like saving money on the back end, like that ties into kind of your, like, the procurement challenges that we see in this industry, right? Like if you plan properly, it may alleviate some of those procurement challenges by giving you a month or a few more weeks in your schedule to allow for that procurement, supply chain issue.
100%.
So, Austin, from your perspective, obviously from a developer perspective, it's important to have consultants with local knowledge who understand the local jurisdiction, regulation, have those relationships. So, what are some of your best practices? You've mentioned communication, being proactive, having a team, and then what has been your experience working across various jurisdictions? So, from what I've experienced, a lot of times, because of the unfamiliarity with these projects, sometimes battery storage will get looped into just being a commercial project, right? Where now Skylar, you're very familiar with this. Now we're, doing offsite improvements and widening roads and things like that for, a 20-year lease area. So if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly what you touched on, just the unfamiliarity and educating jurisdictions, working with them. Jurisdictions ultimately are your friend. They give you the sign off and facilitate the construction of this project. So communicate early and often, get things in writing from them, because they review hundreds and thousands of projects a year. So make for sure that you've got what you talked about in your back pocket readily available. And then just like we've touched on over and over again, just understanding the codes and criteria, just make for sure that you're checking all of the boxes. And sometimes there's not an explicit box to check, but understanding what they are agreeable to and providing them with the necessary information.
Right, and understanding also the partners to pull in. Sorry, go ahead, Skylar.
Yeah, I was going to add to, like you said, there's not an explicit box always to check. Be ready for bumps and bruises. Like, you can do all your homework, all your due diligence. We've got a site now that we've been doing for the past 6 months, engineering pre-apps with the county, everything, and a forensic study was required where it came up that there were trees removed on that property that weren't previously permitted. So now there are tree credits that will be owed on that to be able to move forward with the permitting process. Could be anywhere from $100,000 to $200,000 just to continue what we're doing. Something that, I mean, honestly, you couldn't do enough due diligence to figure that out, I don't think. But yeah, be ready for some bumps and bruises.
It seems like part of, the challenge of battery storage is that there's just going to be a lot of unknowns because of how new it is. But it seems like, early involvement, due diligence is kind of key. As far as just communicating with AHJs, aside from your local like zoning board, maybe doing some pre-application meetings. Are there any other stakeholders who you would recommend getting, buy-off from early on? Maybe like fire department, utility company, things like that. Skylar, I know you've touched on this a little bit before of various requirements that could, make or break a site.
Yeah, fire, the utility, local fire, the drainage. So initiating with the city early and often. Again, we've said that, same with the utility, but also with fire. We have had situations where, we think we're good to go with the civil front and the planning front and the utility, and then fire says, well, we don't allow gravel. We only want an asphalt access path, which then, Emily, changes your new impervious, which can change a lot of drainage design and take a lot of time. You're doing grading designs too and grading reviews on these, which just inherently are not fast processes. So it's good to get that right.
Yeah, Skylar, I would say that's another entity is bake in review time for these jurisdictions. Like we mentioned, they're inundated.
Right.
Their review process can vary jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Even the entities inside the jurisdiction have different review times. Like, I know sometimes it's quicker to get to the fire department than it is drainage, and for the civil improvements, they may have a similar time frame as drainage. So just understanding those review times and incorporating that into your schedule early is key to the project timeline.
Agreed. So as far as just going through some of, the public aspect, public hearings, some of the environmental public concerns. So and James, I'll direct this one at you. What are some common or unusual public concerns that maybe you see as trends on these projects, and how are you best mitigating for both the developer and then Austin also from the design side?
So fire safety is a big one, of course. So, for that, it's ideally you can get the fire department comfortable with what you're proposing well ahead of any kind of public hearing that may be necessary. If you can't get the fire department on site, it's going to be difficult to assuage the public that what you're proposing is going to be safe. So that also comes into the equipment supply discussion of like making sure that the vendor or the integrator that's being selected like does have a good safety record and does know what they're doing when it comes to integrating the system and putting safety features in that are gonna prevent any kind of fire event and shut down any spread if there were to be some fire on one of the sites, one of the systems. So that's kind of number one is fire. Beyond that, I mean, you hear stuff about noise, you hear stuff about visibility, and aesthetics. Depending on where you are, you may have to do a noise study, you may have to do like a traffic study. Yeah, you may have to do an aesthetics like view shed study. It kind of depends on how interested the public is and like what types of levers they have to approve or deny projects in the area. So those are the common ones. You hear stuff about chemical spills once in a while, which actually is not really a problem with lithium ion batteries because there's not really any liquid electrolyte, but any spill would probably just be like coolant. It's kind of similar to like an HVAC system, but that still is something that sometimes comes up. Yeah, I mean, I think those are kind of the big ones. Skylar, interested to hear what you've heard out there.
Yeah, same. Yeah, fire, health hazards. We had somebody come to us yesterday and think that the batteries emitted radiation. So education is key. Getting together, a slideshow or a presentation for these jurisdictions and these public meetings that outline, all the basic concerns that the public are going to have is huge. But yeah, education is key.
Right, and sometimes it's as simple as putting things into perspective, right? You mentioned the refrigerant, and those levels are essentially what you could find in a household item, such as your AC unit. Same with noise. By the time you really put into perspective what the noise is at the property line, based off of code and things like that, it's comparable to the noise of a refrigerator. So sometimes putting things into perspective and educating is important. Austin, is there anything you would add from the civil side?
No, I think they touched on really all of the main concerns that I've seen. I mean, the only other offsite hazard is really the drainage piece. What are you going to do with the rainwater as it sheds off, right? I mean, just understanding that local code and ensuring you're abiding by it. We want to be good stewards to those around us. So, our design should be in line that it's not going to adversely impact a neighboring parcel or property.
I like that phrase is, it's our job to make sure that these things aren't going to adversely affect, from a civil side, a structural side, hazards, all of that. We're abiding by code and just, remind the public of that. Skylar, really quickly, for just, overall hazards, fire safety, chemical spills, things like that. Can you just touch on, that there are measures in place that address hazards, with the local fire department and things like that and their responses? They're familiar with the system, things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there was one up north. I don't recall which city it was, but a large Tesla system, I believe, that caught fire 6 months ago, 7 months ago. And the processes were followed per code, per the UL listings, and the fire did not propagate outside of a single container. They did let the local area know that was within the smoke plume to close all their HVAC systems, shut them off, close your windows. But that was the extent. There's, these fire departments know how to fight these fires. They know how to do the response, and they know how to let the public know when something like this is happening. So I always try to reassure everybody, not only that, but it's, obviously if anything is on fire, you don't want to be breathing in what's coming in, whether it be a battery, whether it be a home, whether it be an office building or a gas station. So yeah, just reassuring everybody that the fire department's on board. They have a plan if anything happens. Above and beyond that, I know the industry is going towards a let it burn mentality, which makes sense with the technology. However, out here with the high volatility for fires. That's not always an acceptable method. The local jurisdictions, as well as the local local town, may not want that. They may want something to assure them that they're going to be able to flood that out and stop those chemicals from going into the atmosphere as much as possible. So there have been some sites where we've had to implement a fire suppression system that connects directly to a fire riser on the outside of the site. It allows them to flood the container. It's more in a cooling manner, right? They will get an early alarm that you're starting to have some thermal runaway. It'll get to a certain temperature. They'll get called out, and they'll just go ahead and flood it to keep that thermal runaway from getting out of hand and from keeping a fire to start. It's on three of our sites out of the 12.
Yeah. So in general, I've seen, like, working with James, there are, like you mentioned and touched on, Skylar, is that there's systems in place. Like, I mean, they're monitored 24/7. They have alarms and systems to notify not only the project owner, but local jurisdictions if they're capable of tapping into that system. And then once the policies and procedures are in place, I mean, like you mentioned on the Tesla site, if they're followed to a T, we see and have seen that there's no catastrophic event occur.
All right, last topic. So developer to EPC handoff. Once these projects are ready to transition to the construction side, what are your recommendations to ensure a smooth transition? Austin, maybe let's start with you from an engineering side. What are things that you would ask, look for, things like that?
Sure, definitely. Yeah, working with developers, I would recommend engaging an EPC on board earlier in the process than you would think. These guys, they are knowledgeable in what they do. They provide a lot of insight into the construction means and methods that us as engineers, we don't always know. We work in tandem with the contractors. So working with that team allows us to design our site in a manner that benefits not only the developer, but the contractor when they install the site, right? We try to design our site in a manner that it's cost effective, they can get it in on time, and then in a efficient manner, so that way it benefits the project as a whole.
And then James, Skylar, any thoughts from the developer side? Skylar, I know you're more kind of traditional design bid build model.
Yeah, we kind of I don't want to say cut out the EPC. I mean, we do our engineering, manage the engineering, do the procurement in house, and then go out to bid for construction. So for that aspect, kicking it off to construction, like you said, getting them involved early. Don't wait until you have permits to give it to a contractor to get bids. There's going to be things that they bring up that maybe you didn't think of. It's good to have everybody give their opinion in as early as possible. I would say also too, just kill them with information. I've heard of people trying to build these projects without even doing geotech studies, which just blows my mind. So geotech studies, surveys, full civil, electrical, structural plans, all your equipment specs and cuts, your data diagrams, an operational sequence of operations, if you will. Just kill them with information. The more the better.
Ultimately, I think they would appreciate that too, as they compile their information.
Yeah,
I would agree. The more the better. All right. Looks like we are close to wrapping this up. So just wanted to go around the group, and if each panelist can just say, your 1 to 2 kind of key takeaways. Austin, we can start with you.
Sure. I know we've kind of repeated this often throughout the presentation here, but engaging local stakeholders early, getting their buy-in, that's key and crucial to the timeline of these projects. And then also just doing the due diligence, understanding the constraints up front, so that way there's no surprise as you walk through the design process.
Skylar, how about you?
I'm going to stick with the expect bumps and bruises. As much due diligence as you can and will do, and the planning involved. This is development. You are looking at properties generally that haven't been developed or being developed for a different use that nobody's looked at before. So, yeah, expect bumps and bruises and don't get beat up too bad whenever there are delays, because there will be delays.
Thanks, James.
Yeah, I think it's really there's a ton of information that's going to be coming at you as you try to develop these projects. So it's really the key things are, first of all, having a good team around you that knows how to get this stuff done and what they need to be looking for in the specific location that you're working. And then just having a good way and a good system in place to be able to take all that information in and have it accessible and have it like organized so that you don't make any there's some mistakes, there's some things that go wrong, some of the bumps and bruises that are unavoidable. And ideally those are the only ones that you're hitting, and it's not because like you forgot about some permit requirement that was on some permit application you submitted 9 months ago, and now you're not in compliance with whatever the EPC is going to be building. So like there's a lot of ways for things to kind of get out of whack, and so the key is just making sure that you have a good system in place to keep everything straight.
Awesome. Those are great takeaways, great insight. All right, it looks like we do have a couple of questions, so I will turn it over to my colleague, Miles Johnson. He is going to ask.
Yeah, thanks. We have a handful here, so not too many, but in some of these you touched on a little bit, maybe you could elaborate a bit. One question here, how often are you seeing AHJs require noise assessments, risk and hazard assessments, or other studies and assessments as part of the approval process?
So I'll let James and Skylar speak to that one first.
Yeah, so more often than not, where I'm at, the noise aspect, I mean, as these are around 70, 75 decibels for cooling fans, when you get a lot of them together, it does amplify that noise. So the noise studies are critical to the project, especially if you're near residential or even like commercial. With the noise levels around 50 decibels at night, you can reach those thresholds very quickly. So good to do sound study up front. Other studies really depends on where you're at. I mean, we've got sites that have like 10 to 12 different studies, from agricultural to hazard analysis to historical to endangered species. The list goes on and on. So really that kind of ties back to the due diligence on the permitting front, knowing what you're going to be doing and talking with the jurisdiction to try to better understand what kind of studies and how many studies they are going to require. And again, sometimes they'll come up maybe when you're 3-4 months into the process, which is frustrating with as much due diligence as you do at the front end, but it kind of is what it is.
Yeah, Skylar, I know on our sites too, I would say maybe half of them have some sort of noise mitigation with a sound wall just due to proximity to, neighbors.
And most of the time we're screening anyway. Right. So we have some level of noise deterrent, if you will, but more often than not, a noise study has been required out here anyway in California.
What's next, Miles?
Great. And I think there's a couple questions here on fire suppression that I think this group mainly answered. One of the questions here asked what have you found to be the most effective ways to separate the fire threat of a BESS system from electric vehicles, EV, or other common unregulated batteries?
Well, I mean, things are getting easier on that front because there's specific codes that are now in place that lay out what's required for standalone battery storage installations. And that can go a long way to convince people that like this has been studied, right? Like a committee of firemen has gotten together somewhere and has come up with this code based on all the best information, and we're now following it. And so, the systems are going to be safe. So I'm really happy to see that the latest codes, both on the IFC and the NFPA side, are inclusive of standalone battery storage installations. Yeah, I mean, there's also a chemistry difference, which I think Skylar, you mentioned that a lot of what you're using is the LFP. That's what we use too. And most of this, most of the batteries that are installed for stationary storage are the LFP, which is the lithium iron phosphate, which is inherently less flammable than what's used in still a lot of the EV applications, which is NMC. And it's because that is just a more dense, they need more density in terms of the power. And so they have to use that more flammable chemistry. So that could be another separation point.
Yeah, just to add to that, I've talked with the battery manufacturers, and they actually do have slightly different chemistries, even in LFP, for the EVs versus the battery storage, right? And they weigh that with safety versus output and discharge and charge rates. So obviously they want to make the EVs as safe as possible. You're driving around in those can be in accidents, those can have issues. So they'll put a little bit safer chemistry in those. They may put a little bit more volatile in these because of the UL listings and the things that are in place to where if a fire does happen, again, it's not going to propagate or spread anywhere. So it's all done within codes and safety regulations.
Great. Just a couple more here. Does this group have any experience or advice in working with utilities and their acreage requirements for switch yards? And have you seen any flexibility in these requirements?
I don't have anything on that one, James. Do you?
Yeah, I mean, I've had success with getting the utilities to change their design requirements when it's a case where it's like, because these are batteries, their typical standards aren't necessarily applicable. Like this happened in like New York City once, where it was like they didn't really have the right specifications for what we were trying to do, so we were able to kind of work with them to get a design in place that could work for us as well as for them in terms of what their acreage requirements are. But if they already know what they're looking at and they have a standard that they want you to follow, yeah, I think that's going to be tough to to get them to relax that. I mean, you can always have those conversations, but yeah, I think that's probably uphill battle there.
Gotcha. Great. And I think, have you seen, so this question is focused on microgrid solutions versus BESS. And if you're seeing utility companies welcoming microgrids to help ease the burden of BESS or the demand, or is BESS projects preferred to microgrid solutions?
So my microgrid knowledge is a few years old. I did used to work for a company that was looking at microgrid development. I think it's just difficult from a regulatory perspective. If you're trying to take different assets that are crossing like property boundaries, it just becomes, it's another layer of complication that you need to get into and be able to, yeah, that to surmount, because you're almost like a utility at that point, right? Because you're like metering people, you're metering customers. And so there's sometimes higher regulatory thresholds that are to protect the customers. And also, yeah, like the utilities sometimes think like, listen, like we're the utility here. We're supposed to have a regulated monopoly. Like, why should you be able to like build a mini utility within our territory? So I've definitely seen, you know, that it's just a harder, there's not been, I don't think the business model hasn't been cracked, like that puzzle hasn't been cracked. Like, how are we going to build microgrids at scale? It's still very bespoke and like specific to where you're trying to build. So from that perspective, I would agree with the question that like battery storage, it's preferred in that it's 1 meter that's going to one customer, either behind one customer's meter or it's its own meter. And it's just a easier like thing for the utilities to wrap their head around and like fit into the existing constructs of what they're used to seeing.
Awesome. Well, I think that was well answered, and thank you all for those are all the questions that were submitted. But I think you all did a great job in thinking on your feet here and answering the attendees' questions. So thank you guys so much.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you to all the attendees and to our panelists. If you have any questions that come to mind after this call is over, again, we will be sending out the panelists' contact information when we send out the recording. So feel free to reach out with anything additional, and we'll do our best to get those answered. Really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks, everyone.